Commander Chin's office felt different this time, smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in under the weight of secrets and betrayal. Morrison sat across from her desk, noting the dark circles under her eyes had deepened, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee from a thermos that had clearly been her sustenance for days. "Jake," she began, using his first name for the first time since the investigation began. "What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about Operation Blackwater, about this team, and about the people you've trusted with your life." Morrison braced himself, unsure whether he was prepared for another devastating revelation. The past 2 weeks had stripped away everything he thought he knew about his world, leaving him feeling like a man waking up from a coma to discover that years had passed and nothing was as he remembered it. Chin opened a classified folder marked with the seal of the Director of National Intelligence. "The investigation has concluded, Jake. We know who was responsible for the fabricated intelligence that led to Dr. Hassan's death. We know why it was done, and we know how the deception was carried out." "Who?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. Chin met his eyes directly. "Me." The word hit Morrison like a sniper's bullet, sudden and devastating. He stared at his commanding officer, the woman who had led them through countless missions, who had fought for their interests against bureaucratic interference, who had earned their respect and loyalty through her competence and integrity. "I don't understand," Morrison managed to say. Chen's composure finally cracked, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as she spoke. Dr. Hassan wasn't randomly selected as a target. He was specifically chosen because of the work he was doing with refugee populations along the Afghan-Pakistan border. His medical clinics were providing aid to families fleeing from violence, but they were also treating wounded fighters from various insurgent groups. Morrison's mind raced to process the information. "You're saying he was supporting terrorists?" "No," Chin said firmly. "He was providing medical aid to anyone who needed it, without regard to their political affiliations or military status. That's what doctors do, what they're supposed to do according to international law. But certain elements within the intelligence community saw his neutrality as a threat to ongoing operations." The pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place in Morrison's mind. "You're talking about the agency." Chin nodded. A CIA cell operating in the region had been conducting interrogations of captured insurgents using methods that violated both military regulations and international treaties. Dr. Hassan had documented evidence of torture victims who had been treated at his clinics. He was preparing to present his findings to international human rights organizations. Morrison felt sick to his stomach, so they decided to eliminate him. The original plan was to discredit him, to plant evidence that he was collaborating with terrorist organizations. But Hassan was too well-respected internationally, and the evidence wouldn't have held up to scrutiny. So they decided on a more permanent solution, and they needed us to carry it out. Chen's tears flowed more freely now. They needed a team with an impeccable reputation, operators whose word would never be questioned. If SEAL Team 6 eliminated a target based on solid intelligence, no one would ever investigate further. The terrorist leader al-Rashid provided the perfect cover, a high-value target that would justify the operation and explain any irregularities. Morrison leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. "How long have you known?" "I began to suspect something was wrong 3 days after the mission," Chin replied. "The intelligence package had been too perfect, too complete. In my experience, real intelligence is messy, incomplete, contradictory. What we received looked like it had been constructed rather than gathered. Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Chin's expression hardened with self-recrimination. "Because I was a coward. I was afraid that if I raised questions, I would be transferred or forced into early retirement, and the team would be left with someone who didn't understand or care about your welfare. I told myself I was protecting you by staying quiet." Morrison understood the impossible position Chun had been placed in. Speaking out against the CIA operation would have ended her career and potentially placed her in physical danger. But remaining silent had made her complicit in murder. "When did you decide to come forward?" Morrison asked. When I saw what the investigation was doing to the team, Chen replied. When I watched 24 good men turn against each other, questioning loyalties and friendships that had been forged in combat. I couldn't let the Brotherhood be destroyed to protect my own cowardice. Morrison felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at Shun for her initial silence, gratitude for her eventual courage, and a growing understanding of how ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil through a series of small compromises and rationalizations. What happens now, he asked. Chen consulted another document from her folder. The CIA officers responsible for fabricating the intelligence have been arrested and will face court-martial proceedings. The torture program they're trying to cover up has been terminated, and its victims are receiving medical treatment and compensation. Dr. Hassan's family has been notified of the truth and will receive full death benefits as well as a formal apology from the United States government. And the team, all charges and suspicions against team members have been dropped. The investigation confirmed that everyone except myself acted in good faith based on the intelligence they were provided. You'll all be restored to full active duty status with commendations for your service. Morrison should have felt relief, but instead he was overwhelmed by a profound sense of loss. Will we be kept together as a unit? Chen's silence answered the question before her words did. The psychological evaluation team has recommended that the unit be disbanded. The trauma of the investigation and the knowledge that you unknowingly participated in killing an innocent man has been deemed too severe to overcome. Most of your teammates are being reassigned to different units or offered early retirement with full benefits. The final blow had been delivered. Even though they were innocent of any wrongdoing, even though they had been manipulated and deceived by people they trusted, the brotherhood that had defined their lives was still destroyed. The investigation had accomplished what 20 years of combat couldn't. It had broken them apart forever. What about you? Morrison asked. I'll be facing court-martial proceedings for dereliction of duty and conspiracy charges. My military career is over, and I'll likely serve time in prison. Chen's voice was steady now, resigned to her fate. It's what I deserve for staying silent when I should have spoken up. Morrison wanted to feel anger toward Chun, wanted to blame her for everything that had happened. But he understood the impossible choices she had faced, the pressure she had been under, the way good people could make terrible decisions when placed in circumstances that offered no clear right answer. I'm sorry, Jake, Chen continued. I'm sorry for failing you and the team. I'm sorry for the guilt you'll carry for the rest of your lives about Dr. Hassan. I'm sorry for destroying something beautiful and irreplaceable because I was too weak to do the right thing when it mattered. Morrison stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 38 years and the weight of 2 decades of service. Commander, permission to speak freely? Granted. You made a mistake, a terrible mistake that cost an innocent man his life and destroyed the best team in the military. But you also found the courage to make it right, even knowing it would cost you everything. That takes a different kind of bravery, and I respect you for it. She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Morrison walked out of her office and drove directly to Murphy's bar, where he knew he would find several of his former teammates drowning their sorrows and trying to make sense of a senseless situation. The bar was crowded with the usual evening crowd, but Morrison immediately spotted Torres, Sullivan, Williams, and Rodriguez sitting at their usual table in the corner. They looked up as he approached, their faces showing the same mixture of relief and devastation that Morrison felt. They knew the truth now, knew they were innocent of any wrongdoing, but they also knew their brotherhood was over, their shared identity destroyed by forces beyond their control. So it's really over, Torres said as Morrison sat down. 20 years of serving together, and it ends like this. Morrison nodded, accepting the beer that Williams slid across to him. Chen told me about the reassignments. Where are you all going? The conversation that followed was surreal in its normalcy. They discussed their new assignments, their families' reactions to the investigation, their plans for the future. But underneath the casual banter, Morrison could feel the profound sadness that connected them all, the knowledge that something precious and irreplaceable had been lost forever. You know what the worst part is? Sullivan said after his third drink. It's not that we killed an innocent man. That's horrible, and I'll carry that guilt until the day I die. But we've all seen innocent people die in war, and we've learned to live with that reality. So, what's the worst part? Rodriguez asked. The worst part is that they made us doubt each other, Sullivan replied. For 2 weeks, I suspected every one of you of being a traitor. I looked at faces I've known for years and wondered if you were capable of betraying everything we stood for. That's what really destroyed us. Not the investigation, but the fact that we let them make us question the one thing that made us special. Morrison understood exactly what Sullivan meant. The Brotherhood hadn't been destroyed by external forces. It had been destroyed from within by their own willingness to believe that one of their own could be capable of such betrayal. The investigators had weaponized their love for each other, turning it into a source of pain and suspicion. As the evening wore on, other team members drifted in and out of the bar. Some joined their table, adding their voices to the conversation and their own perspectives on what had happened. Others simply nodded and moved to different tables, still too wounded by the experience to engage in group discussions. Thompson, the explosives expert, sat down heavily and immediately ordered a double whiskey. You hear what they're calling us in the other units? He asked bitterly. The duped SEALs. Like we're some kind of joke, like we're idiots who can't tell the difference between a terrorist and a doctor. Let them talk, Morrison said firmly. We know what we are, and we know what we've accomplished. One mission doesn't define 20 years of service. Doesn't it, though? Williams asked quietly. Every time someone mentions SEAL Team 6 now, they're going to think about Operation Blackwater. Every mission we completed successfully, every life we saved, every terrorist we eliminated, it's all going to be overshadowed by this one mistake. The truth of Williams' words settled over the table like a shroud. Their legacy, which should have been one of honor and service, would forever be tainted by their unwitting participation in murder. History would remember them not for their heroism, but for their failure to recognize that they were being manipulated. As closing time approached, the teammates began to drift away, heading home to families who were still struggling to understand how their heroes had become unwitting villains. Morrison was one of the last to leave, sitting alone with his thoughts and his beer as the bartender cleaned glasses and counted the evening's receipts. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Master Chief Morrison, this is Dr. Amira Hassan, Ahmed's daughter. I wanted you to know that my family holds no anger toward you or your teammates. We know you were deceived just as surely as we were. My father would have forgiven you, and so do we. Morrison stared at the message through blurred vision, overwhelmed by the grace and forgiveness of a family that had every right to hate him. Dr. Hassan's daughter was offering something he couldn't offer himself, absolution for his role in her father's death. He typed back slowly, Your father was a good man who died because of our failure to question what we were told. I will carry the responsibility for that for the rest of my life. Thank you for your forgiveness. Her response came quickly. My father always said that the greatest tragedy is not when good people do bad things, but when they stop believing in the possibility of goodness. Please don't let what happened destroy your faith in the Brotherhood you served with such honor. Morrison walked out of the bar into the cool Virginia beach night, breathing in the salt air from the nearby ocean. In the distance, he could see the lights of naval ships anchored in the harbor, their crews preparing for deployments that would take them to dangerous places where they would trust their lives to the men standing beside them. The silence that had fallen over the SEALs would never be completely broken. The words that had shattered their brotherhood could never be unsaid, and the trust that had been lost could never be fully restored. But Morrison realized that Dr. Hassan's daughter was right. The greatest tragedy would be to let the destruction of their unit destroy their belief in the possibility of such brotherhood existing. Somewhere else, other warriors were forging the same bonds of trust and loyalty that had once made Morrison's team invincible. They were learning to depend on each other in ways that civilians could never understand, creating relationships that transcended blood and family. As long as such bonds continued to exist, as long as people were willing to trust their lives to the person standing next to them, the spirit of what SEAL Team 6 had once been would survive. The sentence that had changed everything. The man we killed was not Khalil al-Rashid, the terrorist leader, had indeed fallen like a devastating blow upon the brotherhood of warriors. But from the silence that followed, Morrison hoped might eventually come a different kind of understanding. That even good people could be manipulated into terrible acts, and that the only defense against such manipulation was the courage to question authority, even when that authority wore the uniform of your own side. The SEALs had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest enemies are those who claim to be fighting on your side, and sometimes the greatest courage is required not to pull the trigger, but to refuse to when something doesn't feel right. Morrison walked to his car, knowing he would never see most of his teammates again, knowing their shared story would be remembered more for its tragic ending than its heroic chapters. But he also knew that Dr. Hassan's daughter had given him something more valuable than absolution. She had given him hope that the bonds of brotherhood, however damaged, could still serve as a foundation for something better. The silence had fallen over the SEALs, but it wouldn't last forever. Somewhere, somehow, they would find new ways to serve, new people to trust, and new reasons to believe in the possibility of honor, even in a world filled with deception and betrayal. The truth had indeed changed everything. But perhaps, Morrison thought as he drove home through the quiet streets of Virginia Beach, that change might ultimately be for the better. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not against external enemies, but against the darkness that can grow within even the best of men when they stop asking the questions that matter most. The sentence that had destroyed them had also, in its own terrible way, set them free. Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who preferred staying in the background. At 28, she had built a solid career as a logistics coordinator at Fort Henderson, managing supply chains, and making sure equipment arrived where it needed to be. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important, and Sarah took pride in her efficiency and attention to detail. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at her office at 7 sharp, coffee in hand, ready to tackle another day of inventory reports and shipping schedules. The desert air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to paint the mountains surrounding the base in shades of gold and orange. She settled into her routine, checking overnight emails and preparing for the morning briefing. Around 10 o'clock, her supervisor, Major Collins, stuck his head into her office. "Martinez, I need you to head over to Range 7. We've got some visiting instructors running advanced training exercises, and they need someone to coordinate equipment logistics on site." Sarah nodded, gathering her clipboard and radio. Range 7 was one of the more remote training areas on the base, used primarily for specialized tactical exercises. She'd been there before, usually to deliver equipment or coordinate supply drops. It was typically a straightforward assignment. The drive to Range 7 took about 20 minutes through winding desert roads. As Sarah approached the range, she could see a group of soldiers in camouflage gear spread across the terrain, some lying prone with rifles, others standing around observing. This wasn't unusual, but something about the intensity of their focus told her this was no ordinary training exercise. She parked her Jeep near the command tent and was immediately approached by a tall, weathered man in his 40s wearing instructor badges. His name tag read Sergeant First Class Morrison, and his steely gray eyes seemed to take in everything around him with military precision. "You the logistics coordinator?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years in combat zones. "Yes, sir. Sarah Martinez. I'm here to assist with equipment coordination for your exercise." Morrison nodded toward the range where soldiers were positioned at various distances from targets. "We're running long-range precision shooting drills today. My team is working with your unit's designated marksmen, pushing their limits, seeing what they're really capable of. Sarah had worked around military training exercises for years, but there was something different about this group. The soldiers weren't just going through motions. There was an intensity, a focus that suggested this training was preparing them for something real and immediate. "What kind of support do you need?" Sarah asked, pulling out her clipboard. "Right now, we're good on equipment," Morrison replied, then paused, studying her with those calculating eyes. "But I'm curious about something. You work logistics, right? A lot of desk work." Sarah felt a slight defensive edge creep into her voice. "I coordinate supply chains and equipment deployment across the base. It requires attention to detail and physical coordination when needed." Morrison smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Physical coordination. Right." He gestured toward the range where one of his snipers was setting up for a shot at what looked like an incredibly distant target. "See that target out there? That's at 1,200 meters. Takes years of training to hit something consistently at that distance. Requires not just skill, but physical endurance, mental discipline, the ability to control your breathing and heartbeat." Sarah wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but she sensed a challenge brewing. "I'm sure it's very demanding work. You know what the real test is, though?" Morrison continued, his tone becoming more conversational, but somehow more pointed. "It's not hitting one target at 1,200 meters. Any decent marksman can do that with enough practice. The real test is hitting multiple targets at increasing distances while under physical stress. We call it progressive stress shooting." One of the other instructors, a woman named Staff Sergeant Chun, approached them. She had clearly been listening to the conversation. "Sergeant Morrison, are you thinking about the 3,800-meter challenge?" Morrison's eyes lit up with what Sarah could only describe as mischief. "That's exactly what I'm thinking about." Sarah felt compelled to ask, even though she sensed she might regret it. "What's the 3,800-meter challenge?" Morrison exchanged a look with Chun before answering. "It's something we developed for advanced training. A shooter starts at the 800-meter line and has to hit 5 targets. Then they move to 1,200 meters, hit 5 more targets. Then 1,800 meters for 5 targets, 2,400 meters for 5 targets, and finally 3,800 meters for the last 5 targets." "That sounds incredibly difficult," Sarah said, trying to sound appropriately impressed. "Oh, that's not the hard part," Chun chimed in with a grin. "The hard part is that between each shooting position, you have to complete a physical challenge. 100-meter sprint, obstacle course, rope climb, tire flip, and a final endurance run, all while carrying full gear and maintaining your weapon." Sarah was beginning to understand why this was called a challenge and not just training. "Has anyone ever completed it?" Morrison nodded. 3 people in the past 2 years. All experienced snipers with years of combat experience. It typically takes between 6 and 8 hours to complete, if you can complete it all. There was something in Morrison's tone that made Sarah suspicious. This wasn't just casual conversation. "Why are you telling me this?" Morrison shrugged, but his expression remained calculating. "Just curious if someone from the logistics side would even understand what real physical and mental challenge looks like. I mean, coordinating paperwork and supply deliveries is important work, but it's not exactly pushing human limits." The comment stung more than Sarah wanted to admit. She had always been sensitive about being seen as just a logistics coordinator, especially in an environment where combat roles were more highly valued. She knew Morrison was baiting her, but the competitive part of her personality, the part that had driven her to excel in everything she had ever attempted, was rising to the surface. "I think I understand challenge just fine," Sarah replied, her voice cooler now. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" "Because I look at you and I see someone who's built a nice, comfortable career in a climate-controlled office. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not exactly preparing you for real adversity." Sarah felt her face flush. She was aware that other soldiers had stopped what they were doing and were now listening to this conversation. Word traveled fast on military bases, and she knew that if she backed down from whatever Morrison was implying, it would be around the base by evening. What exactly are you suggesting? Sarah asked. Morrison's smile became more genuine, but also more predatory. I'm suggesting that someone who truly understands challenge might be willing to attempt something like the 3,800-meter challenge. Not necessarily to complete it, but to see what they're really made of. The gauntlet was officially thrown down. Sarah looked around at the faces watching this exchange. Some seemed sympathetic, others curious, and a few appeared skeptical that someone from logistics would even consider such a thing. Sarah had always prided herself on being rational and practical. The smart thing to do would be to laugh this off, make some joke about staying in her lane, and get back to her actual job. But as she stood there in the desert sun, feeling the weight of expectations and assumptions, something inside her rebelled against the easy choice. You really think I couldn't handle it? Sarah asked. Morrison shrugged. I don't think you could handle the first physical challenge, honestly. But I could be wrong. The silence stretched between them for several seconds. Sarah could hear the desert wind rustling through the sparse vegetation and the distant sound of gunfire from another part of the range. She thought about her comfortable routine, her predictable days, her safe choices. Then she thought about her father, who had been a Marine and had always told her that the only real failure was not trying when something mattered. Okay, Sarah said quietly. Morrison leaned forward slightly. Okay, what? Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. Okay, I'll do your 3,800-meter challenge. The response from the watching soldiers was immediate. Some whistled in surprise, others shook their heads in disbelief, and a few began talking excitedly among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Morrison's expression shifted from challenging to serious. Martinez, I want to make sure you understand what you just agreed to. This isn't a joke or some kind of team-building exercise. This challenge has sent experienced soldiers to the medical tent. It's designed to find the absolute limit of human endurance and skill. Sarah felt a flutter of fear in her stomach, but her voice remained steady. I understand. Chun stepped forward. Sarah, can I call you Sarah? You seem like a smart woman. You don't have anything to prove to anyone here. Logistics coordination is skilled, important work. There's no shame in staying in your area of expertise. Sarah appreciated Chen's attempt to give her a graceful way out, but she could see Morrison watching her reaction with interest. She realized that backing down now would confirm every assumption he had made about her. I appreciate that, Staff Sergeant Chun, but I've made my decision. Morrison nodded slowly. All right then, we'll need to set this up properly. This can't be some spur-of-the-moment thing. You'll need proper equipment, medical clearance, and official permission from your commanding officer. How long do I have to prepare? Sarah asked. Morrison looked at Chun, who checked her watch and consulted a tablet. We're here for 2 more weeks. If you're serious about this, we could set it up for next Friday. That give you 10 days to prepare physically and mentally. 10 days. Sarah's mind raced through everything she would need to do. Physical training, shooting practice, equipment familiarization, and somehow continuing her regular duties without letting her performance slip. What kind of preparation do you recommend? Sarah asked. Morrison's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more instructional and less antagonistic. First, you need to get cleared by medical. This kind of physical stress can reveal health issues you didn't know you had. Second, you need to spend time on the shooting range every day. You'll be using a standard M24 sniper weapon system, so you need to get familiar with it. Third, you need to build your physical endurance. The challenge is as much about maintaining performance while exhausted as it is about any individual skill. Sarah nodded, taking mental notes. What about the specific physical challenges between shooting positions? Chun pulled out a detailed sheet. The 100-meter sprint is straightforward. The obstacle course includes rope climbs, wall traversals, and low crawls. The rope climb is 30 feet straight up. The tire flip involves moving a 400-pound tractor tire 50 meters. And the final endurance run is 2 miles through desert terrain while carrying full gear. As Chun described each challenge, Sarah felt her confidence wavering. She was in decent shape, but nothing like this level of physical demand. She had never fired a sniper rifle, never climbed a 30-foot rope, and never flipped a 400-pound tire. "I know what you're thinking," Morrison said, apparently reading her expression. "You're wondering what the hell you just got yourself into." Sarah forced a smile. "Something like that." "Good. That means you're starting to understand the reality of what you've committed to." "But here's the thing, Martinez. I've seen people surprise themselves when they're truly pushed. I've also seen people discover they weren't as tough as they thought they were. Which one you are, we'll find out next Friday." As Sarah drove back to her office, her mind was spinning with the magnitude of what she had just committed to. She had gone from coordinating supply deliveries to agreeing to attempt one of the most demanding physical and mental challenges on the base. But underneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else: excitement. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was about to discover something important about herself. Whether that discovery would be positive or devastating remained to be seen. The next morning, Sarah woke up before her alarm with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. The reality of what she had agreed to was settling in, and in the harsh light of dawn, her decision seemed somewhere between incredibly brave and completely insane. Her first stop was the base medical facility for the required physical clearance. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the base physician, had known Sarah for 3 years and was clearly puzzled by the request. "A 3,800-meter challenge?" Dr. Reeves asked, reviewing the medical requirements form. "Sarah, this is typically requested by special operations personnel or advanced marksmen. Are you sure about this?" Sarah had spent half the night rehearsing her explanation. "I want to push my limits, see what I'm capable of. I know it's not typical for someone in logistics, but I have official permission from Major Collins." Dr. Reeves conducted a thorough examination, checking Sarah's cardiovascular health, joint mobility, and overall physical condition. "Your baseline health is excellent," she concluded. "But I have to warn you, this kind of extreme physical stress can cause injuries that might affect your career. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Sarah nodded, though the question made her stomach tighten further. "I understand the risks." After receiving medical clearance, Sarah headed to the armory to check out the M24 sniper weapon system she would be using. Master Sergeant Williams, the armory supervisor, was another longtime colleague who seemed baffled by her request. "Martinez, this weapon system weighs 15 pounds unloaded," he explained, hefting the rifle. "You'll be carrying it, plus ammunition, plus full gear, over several miles of desert terrain. Have you ever fired anything larger than a service pistol?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but I have 10 days to learn." Williams shook his head, but began explaining the weapon's operation. The M24 was a precision instrument, capable of accurate shots at extraordinary distances, but it required skill and experience to use effectively. As Sarah held the rifle for the first time, she was struck by its weight and the complexity of its scope and adjustment systems. "The good news," Williams continued, "is that Staff Sergeant Chun has agreed to provide shooting instruction every afternoon this week. The bad news is that becoming proficient with this weapon typically takes months, not days." Sarah's afternoon shooting lesson with Chun was both encouraging and humbling. Chun was a patient instructor who clearly had extensive experience with precision shooting. The fundamentals are breathing control, trigger discipline, and understanding how environmental factors affect your shot, Chun explained as they set up at the 300-meter range. At longer distances, you have to account for wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the Earth. Sarah's first attempts at 300 meters were disastrous. She missed the target completely on her first 5 shots, and her 6th shot barely clipped the outer edge. But Chun remained encouraging. "Your form is actually pretty good," Chun observed. "You're just overthinking it. Let the training take over. Don't try to control every variable." By the end of the session, Sarah was hitting the target consistently at 300 meters, though nowhere near the center. It was progress, but she had a long way to go before she could attempt shots at 3,800 meters. Her physical training began that evening with a meeting with Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the base fitness instructor. Rodriguez had developed a crash conditioning program specifically for Sarah's challenge. 10 days isn't enough time to build significant strength or endurance, Rodriguez explained as they walked through the base gym. What we can do is teach your body to perform under stress and improve your recovery between high-intensity efforts. The training regimen Rodriguez designed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Each day would include interval running, functional strength training, rope climbing practice, and tire flipping. The sessions would gradually increase in intensity while decreasing recovery time between exercises. The key is teaching your body to maintain precision when you're exhausted, Rodriguez explained. That's what this challenge really tests. Sarah's first training session was a wake-up call. The rope climb, which looked straightforward, proved nearly impossible. She could barely make it halfway up the 30-foot rope before her arms gave out completely. The tire flip was even worse. The 400-pound tire seemed immovable, and Sarah could barely budge it on her first attempts. By the end of the session, Sarah was completely exhausted and questioning her decision. But Rodriguez seemed pleased with her effort. "You showed up, and you didn't quit," he said. "That's more than some people do on their first day. The rest is just training." Word of Sarah's challenge was spreading around the base faster than she had anticipated. By her third day of preparation, she was receiving encouragement from unexpected sources and skepticism from others. Some colleagues thought she was making a statement about gender equality in combat roles. Others believed she was having some kind of personal crisis. Major Collins called her into his office on Thursday to discuss the situation. "Martinez, I want to make sure you're approaching this for the right reasons," he said, his tone concerned rather than disapproving. "You're a valued member of this team, and I don't want to see you get hurt trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." Sarah had been thinking about her motivations constantly over the past few days. "Sir, I think I've been playing it safe my entire career. This is a chance to see what I'm really capable of when everything is on the line." Major Collins nodded slowly. "I can respect that. Just remember that there's no shame in stopping if things become dangerous. This challenge is designed to find people's limits, not to break them." By the end of her first week of preparation, Sarah was showing significant improvement in some areas and struggling in others. Her shooting had progressed to consistently hitting targets at 800 meters, though accuracy at longer distances remained elusive. Her physical conditioning was improving, and she could now climb the 30-foot rope, though it still took tremendous effort. The tire flip remained her biggest challenge. Even after a week of practice, she could only move the 400-pound tire about 20 meters before complete exhaustion set in. Rodriguez was encouraging but realistic about her prospects. "You're getting stronger, but this particular challenge might be beyond what we can achieve in 10 days, he admitted. The tire flip is really designed for people with extensive strength training backgrounds. Morrison checked on Sarah's progress twice during the week, and his attitude seemed to shift from antagonistic to genuinely curious. During their second meeting, his tone was more serious. "Martinez, I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for what you're attempting," he said. "I've been training special operations personnel for 15 years, and most of them would be hesitant to attempt this challenge without months of specific preparation." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but it also added to her pressure. "Do you think I have a realistic chance of completing it?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "I think you have a chance of surprising yourself. Whether that translates to completing the full challenge, I honestly don't know. But I can tell you that you've already accomplished something significant just by taking it seriously." The second week of preparation was more intense and focused. Sarah's shooting instructor, Chun, began taking her to longer ranges, working up to 1,200-meter shots. These distances required not just technical skill, but an almost meditative level of concentration. "At this range, you're not just shooting at a target," Chun explained during a session at the 1,200-meter range. "You're calculating wind patterns, air density, target movement. It's as much mental as physical." Sarah's progress at long distances was inconsistent. Some days she could hit the 1,200-meter target 3 out of 5 times, Other days, she missed completely. The variability was frustrating, but Chen assured her it was normal for someone with her limited experience. Consistency comes with time and repetition, Chen said. What you're developing is the fundamental understanding of the process. That's what will serve you when you're under stress. Her physical training with Rodriguez was showing more consistent improvement. The rope climb was becoming routine, her running endurance had improved significantly, and she was completing the obstacle course sections with growing confidence. The tire flip remained challenging, but she could now move at the required 50 meters, though it left her completely exhausted. Your cardiovascular recovery is much better, Rodriguez observed during a training session. You're learning to manage your energy output over extended periods. 3 days before the challenge, Morrison organized a partial test run. Sarah would complete the first 2 shooting positions with their associated physical challenges, giving her a realistic sense of what the full challenge would demand. The test began at dawn on a Wednesday morning. Sarah felt nervous, but more prepared than she had expected. She had spent 2 weeks thinking about this moment, and her body felt stronger and more capable than ever before. The first shooting position at 800 meters went better than expected. Sarah hit 4 of her 5 targets, a performance that would have been unimaginable 2 weeks earlier. The 100-meter sprint that followed was manageable, though she could feel the added weight of her gear and weapon. The second shooting position at 1,200 meters was more challenging. The distance made precise shooting significantly more difficult, and the physical stress from the sprint affected her stability. She managed to hit 3 of 5 targets, a respectable showing under the circumstances. The obstacle course that followed was where Sarah truly understood what she had gotten herself into. By the time she completed the rope climb, wall traversals, and low crawls, she was more exhausted than she had ever been in her life. Her hands were shaking from fatigue, her breathing was labored, and her legs felt unsteady. This is what the real challenge will feel like, Morrison observed as Sarah sat recovering in the shade of the command tent. Except you'll be doing it for 8 hours instead of 2. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. She had completed more than she had thought possible 2 weeks earlier. Whether she could sustain that performance for the full challenge remained to be seen, but she had proven something important to herself about her capabilities. That evening, Sarah called her father, retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, to tell him about the challenge. She had been hesitant to mention it earlier, knowing he would worry about her safety. "Sweetheart, you know I support whatever you decide to do," her father said after she explained the situation. "But I want you to remember something. The real victory isn't completing some artificial challenge. The real victory is discovering that you're tougher than you thought you were. And it sounds like you've already done that." His words stayed with Sarah through the final 2 days of preparation. She had indeed discovered reserves of physical and mental toughness she hadn't known existed. Whether that would be enough for the full challenge would be determined on Friday morning. The night before the challenge, Sarah lay in bed thinking about the past 2 weeks. She had pushed her body beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. She had learned to shoot accurately at distances that had seemed impossible. She had developed physical capabilities she had never possessed. But more than that, she had changed something fundamental about how she saw herself. The cautious, comfort-seeking person who had walked into range 2 weeks ago had been replaced by someone willing to risk failure in pursuit of discovering her true limits. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah realized that regardless of what happened the next day, she had already accomplished something significant. She had stopped playing it safe and started playing to win. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear desert air that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Sarah woke at 4:30 a.m., her body automatically responding to 2 weeks of intensive training. Her stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread as she prepared for what would either be the most triumphant or humiliating day of her military career. The challenge was scheduled to begin at 6 a.m., giving her time for a light breakfast and final equipment check. As she dressed in her combat gear, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different from the one who had walked into range 2 weeks ago. Her shoulders were broader, her posture more confident, and her eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. When Sarah arrived at range 7, she was surprised to find a larger crowd than expected. Word of the logistics coordinator attempting the 3,800-meter challenge had spread throughout the base, and dozens of off-duty personnel had come to witness what many considered either an inspiring attempt or spectacular failure. Morrison approached her with what looked like genuine respect. "Martinez, I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, you've already earned something that can't be taken away. You showed up, and you prepared seriously. That means something." Sarah nodded, touched by his acknowledgement. "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot coming from you." Dr. Reeves was on hand to monitor Sarah's vital signs throughout the challenge. She attached a heart rate monitor and checked Sarah's blood pressure before giving her medical clearance to proceed. "Remember," Dr. Reeves said, "this is about pushing your limits, not breaking yourself. If you feel dizzy, nauseous, or experience chest pain, you stop immediately. Pride isn't worth permanent injury." The rules of the challenge were simple but unforgiving. Sarah had to hit at least 3 of 5 targets at each shooting position to continue. The physical challenges between positions had to be completed within specified time limits. Any failure meant the end of the attempt. At 6 a.m. sharp, Morrison called out "Challenge begins" and started a stopwatch. The first shooting position at 800 meters felt almost routine after 2 weeks of intensive practice. Sarah settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and began engaging targets. Her first shot was a solid hit near the center of the target. Her second shot was also on target. Her third shot was slightly wide, but still within the scoring area. As she lined up her fourth shot, Sarah became aware of the crowd, watching in complete silence. The pressure was immense, but her training took over. The fourth shot was another hit. Her fifth and final shot at this distance was her best of the series, striking dead center. 5 for 5 at 800 meters. Chin called out, and Sarah heard scattered applause from the watching crowd. The 100-meter sprint that followed was manageable. Sarah's cardiovascular conditioning had improved dramatically over the past 2 weeks, and she completed the run within the time limit while carrying full gear and her weapon. The second shooting position at 1,200 meters was where the challenge began to reveal its true difficulty. The increased distance made precise shooting significantly more challenging, and the physical stress from the sprint affected Sarah's stability and concentration. Her first shot missed completely, sailing wide of the target. Sarah felt a flutter of panic, but forced herself to slow down and focus. Her second shot was a solid hit. Her third shot was on target, but near the edge of the scoring zone. Her fourth shot missed, and suddenly, Sarah was facing the possibility of failure at only the second position. Everything depended on her fifth and final shot at 1,200 meters. Sarah took extra time to control her breathing and account for the slight crosswind she had detected. The shot felt good as it left the barrel, and after what seemed like an eternity, Chin called out, "Hit!" 3 of 5 at 1,200 meters. Martinez continues. The relief Sarah felt was short-lived as she faced the obstacle course that served as the second physical challenge. The course included a 30-foot rope climb, wall traversals, low crawls under wire obstacles, and a final sprint to the next shooting position. By the time Sarah completed the rope climb, her arms were burning and her grip strength was severely compromised. The wall traversals required her to climb over 8-foot barriers while carrying her weapon and gear, and she could feel her legs beginning to shake from fatigue. The low crawls under wire obstacles were particularly brutal. Sarah had to drag herself and her equipment under barriers that forced her to stay flat against the rocky ground. By the time she emerged from the final obstacle, her uniform was torn and she was breathing heavily. The third shooting position at 1,800 meters represented a quantum leap in difficulty. At this distance, environmental factors like wind speed and air density had major impacts on bullet trajectory. Sarah had practiced at this range only a few times during her preparation, and her success rate had been inconsistent at best. As she settled into her shooting position, Sarah became acutely aware of the physical stress she was already carrying. Her hand was shaking slightly from the rope climb, her breathing was still elevated from the obstacle course, and sweat was making it difficult to maintain a clear sight picture through her scope. Her first shot at 1,800 meters was wide, missing the target entirely. Her second shot was closer, but still missed. Sarah felt the pressure mounting as she realized she needed to hit at least 3 of her remaining 3 shots to continue. She forced herself to slow down, taking extra time to account for the wind conditions and her own physical state. Her third shot was a solid hit, bringing scattered cheers from the watching crowd. Her fourth shot was also on target, hitting near the edge of the scoring zone. With 1 shot remaining, Sarah needed 1 more hit to continue. She took nearly 2 minutes to prepare for the shot, checking and rechecking her scope adjustments and wind calculations. When she finally fired, the shot felt perfect. After a long pause, Chen announced hit. 3 of 5 at 1,800 meters. The third physical challenge was the tire flip, Sarah's greatest weakness throughout her training. The 400-pound tractor tire had to be flipped end over end for a distance of 50 meters. During training, this challenge had consistently left Sarah completely exhausted. As Sarah approached the massive tire, she could hear encouraging shouts from the crowd, but she was entering a zone of physical stress unlike anything she had previously experienced. Her legs felt unsteady, her grip strength was compromised, and she was beginning to question whether she had enough left to complete the challenge. The first flip of the tire took tremendous effort. Sarah had to squat down, get her hands under the tire's edge, and use her legs and back to flip it over. The second flip was slightly easier as she found a rhythm. By the 10th flip, she was operating on pure determination. Halfway through the 50-meter distance, Sarah's legs were shaking uncontrollably, and she was gasping for air. The crowd had become completely silent, watching what was clearly a supreme test of human willpower. Several times, Sarah paused for long moments, bent over the tire, gathering the strength for the next flip. With 10 meters remaining, Sarah wasn't sure she could continue. The tire seemed to weigh twice as much as when she started, and her vision was beginning to blur from exhaustion. But something inside her refused to quit. Perhaps it was the memory of Morrison's initial challenge, or her father's words about discovering her true toughness, or simply the desire to find out what she was truly capable of. She completed the tire flip with a final, desperate effort that left her collapsed beside the tire, completely spent. Dr. Reeves immediately rushed over to check her vital signs, but after a few minutes of rest and hydration, Sarah was cleared to continue. The fourth shooting position at 2,400 meters was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted. At this distance, the target appeared impossibly small through her scope, and the slightest error in calculation or execution would result in a complete miss. Sarah's physical condition was now a major factor in her performance. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, her breathing was labored, and maintaining a stable shooting position required tremendous effort. She knew that her margin for error was essentially zero. Her first shot at 2,400 meters missed by several feet. Her second shot was closer, but still wide of the target. Sarah felt a familiar panic rising, but forced herself to slow down and think through the problem methodically. She realized that her shooting fundamentals, drilled into her over 2 weeks of intensive training, were still solid despite her exhaustion. She needed to trust her training and stop trying to compensate for her physical state. Her third shot was a hit, bringing loud cheers from the crowd. Her fourth shot was also on target. With 1 shot remaining, Sarah again needed just 1 more hit to continue to the final challenge. She took nearly 3 minutes to prepare for her final shot at 2,400 meters, using every technique Chen had taught her about long-range shooting. The shot felt good as it left the barrel, and after what seemed like forever, Chen called out hit. 3 of 5 at 2,400 meters. The fourth physical challenge was a 2-mile endurance run through desert terrain while carrying full gear. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a manageable challenge for Sarah after her conditioning program. But after 3.5 hours of the most demanding physical and mental stress she had ever experienced, it represented a monumental test of endurance. The run began on relatively flat ground, but soon moved into rolling hills and rocky terrain that made footing treacherous. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of lead, and she was forced to adopt a pace that was barely faster than walking. About halfway through the run, Sarah began experiencing moments of dizziness that forced her to stop and recover. Dr. Reeves, who was following in a vehicle, checked on her several times and offered to end the challenge for medical reasons. "I can make it," Sarah insisted, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The final mile of the run was completed through sheer willpower. Sarah's pace had slowed to barely more than a fast walk, and she was stopping every few hundred meters to rest. But she kept moving forward, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. When she finally reached the final shooting position, Sarah collapsed onto the ground and lay there for several minutes, completely spent. The crowd, which had been following her progress throughout the day, burst into spontaneous applause. But the challenge wasn't over. Sarah still faced the most difficult shooting position of all, 5 targets at 3,800 meters. At this extreme distance, the targets were barely visible even through her high-powered scope. Environmental factors had enormous impacts on bullet trajectory, and even slight errors in calculation would result in misses by dozens of feet. Sarah's physical condition was now beyond exhausted. She had been pushing her body at maximum effort for nearly 6 hours, and every system was operating at the edge of failure. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her vision was blurry, and she could barely maintain focus on the scope. Morrison approached her as she prepared for the final shooting sequence. "Martinez, I want you to know that you've already accomplished something extraordinary. No one here expected you to make it this far. There's no shame in calling it here." Sarah looked at him through eyes that were glazed with exhaustion. "How many people have made it to this final position? In the 2 years we've been running this challenge, you're only the 4th person to reach the 3,800-meter position," Morrison replied. Sarah nodded and turned back to her rifle. She had come too far to quit now. Her first shot at 3,800 meters disappeared into the desert without any indication of where it had gone. Her second shot was also a complete miss. By her third shot, Sarah was operating purely on muscle memory and instinct. The third shot was still a miss, but Chen called out that it had at least been visible near the target area. Sarah's fourth shot was also a miss, leaving her with just 1 shot remaining and needing at least 3 hits to complete the challenge. As Sarah prepared for her final shot, the crowd had grown completely silent. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, regardless of the outcome. Sarah took nearly 5 minutes to prepare for her last shot. She checked and rechecked her scope adjustments, calculated and recalculated wind factors, and tried to control her breathing and heart rate despite her extreme exhaustion. When she finally fired, Sarah knew immediately that something was different about the shot. It felt perfect leaving the barrel, and her follow-through was textbook despite her physical condition. After what seemed like an eternity, Chen's voice broke the silence. Mississippi Sarah Martinez has completed 4 of 5 shooting positions, but was unable to achieve the required accuracy at 3,800 meters. The crowd burst into sustained applause anyway. Sarah had not technically completed the 3,800-meter challenge, but she had achieved something that only 3 other people had ever managed, reaching the final shooting position. As Sarah lay on the ground recovering, Morrison knelt beside her. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. 2 weeks ago, I made assumptions about what you were capable of based on your job description and my own prejudices. You've proven that determination and character matter more than job classifications. Dr. Reeves conducted a thorough medical evaluation and determined that Sarah had pushed herself to the absolute limit of human endurance, but had not suffered any serious injuries. Her recovery would take several days, but she would emerge from the experience stronger than before. Over the following weeks, word of Sarah's attempt at the 3,800-meter challenge spread throughout the military community. She became something of a legend, not for completing the challenge, but for her willingness to attempt something that seemed impossible and her refusal to quit when things became difficult. Major Collins recommended Sarah for a commendation for her demonstration of exceptional dedication and perseverance. More importantly, Sarah discovered that her experience had opened doors to opportunities she had never considered. She was offered the chance to cross-train with special operations units and eventually transitioned into a role that combined her logistical expertise with field operations. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. Sarah had discovered reserves of physical and mental toughness she never knew existed. She had learned that comfort zones are self-imposed limitations, and that true growth comes from willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something extraordinary. 6 months later, Sarah returned to Range 7 for another attempt at the 3,800-meter challenge. This time, she completed it successfully, becoming only the 4th person ever to do so. But by then, the completion was almost anticlimactic. The real victory had occurred during that first attempt, when a logistics coordinator decided to stop playing it safe and started playing to discover her true limits. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her motivation for attempting the challenge, her answer was always the same. I realized that I had been living my entire life afraid of finding out what I was truly capable of. Sometimes, the scariest thing you can do is discover that you're much stronger than you ever imagined.